My mother, Ruby Rouse Giddens, was born in Alapaha, Georgia, which is in Berrien County in South Georgia, on March the 15th, 1910. Her parents were J.J. and Sarah Rouse, Sarah Fletcher Rouse. She had a brother named James Paul, and I'm not sure who was the oldest, my mother or my Uncle Paul. And then there was a third child born, and the child's name was James Aldine. James Aldine died as an infant. Sarah became ill, and she passed away when my mother was just a baby, about 2 to 3 years old. So there was my grandfather Rouse left with 2 very small children, and they lived with him for a time, I suppose, because I can remember my mother talking about going to school in Enigma, Georgia, which is a few miles just to the west of Alapaha, where she was born. Eventually, Mother and Uncle Paul were taken by her grandparents, John and Catherine Fletcher. John and Catherine Fletcher lived in Berrien County at the time. Because I was a very small child when I first knew my grandmother, great-grandmother, and grandfather John and Catherine Fletcher. I can remember going to their farm in Berrien County, a few miles outside of Nashville, Georgia. And I can remember that he had quite a large farmland. He had some timber, he had cattle, and I always enjoyed going out there to visit. I can only remember the times that I can see the cattle coming up the road. They had been in the woods, gathering the cattle out of the woods, and I could see all these dozens and dozens of cattle coming up the road with these cowboys, and their cow whips popping and snapping, and they were yelling and driving the cows along and getting them ready to, I guess, take it to the market. And ironically, some of the help that went out to help Grandpa Fletcher hunt the cows out of the woods happened to be the grandparents, the grandfather and uncles and father of my wife, Harriet. Buddy Gibbs, his brothers, Carl and Billy, and Grandpa's grandsons, Hoover and Wilbur, would help with the cattle drives, and some of the neighbors as well. But anyway, I thought it was kind of ironic that our families had that, passed across in those days. I can remember Grandpa had a horse named Charlie. It was a big red horse. I thought that was the biggest horse I was ever seen because I was only about 5 or 6 years old at the time, as I remember. And he put me on that horse one day, and I got so frightened. The horse didn't throw me, I just fell off. And Grandpa caught me, and to this day I haven't had much use for getting on horses.
Now you've told a funny story in the past about Grandpa driving a car as if it were a horse. Can you recall that story again?
My mother used to tell this story when Grandpa first got his first car. My mother used to say that when he first got in it to drive it, and he didn't know how to stop it, and he kept saying, "Whoa, whoa." Evidently someone who was in a car with him told him to put his foot on the brake. But anyway, my mother would tell that story.
Yeah.
I can remember that Grandmother Fletcher was always kind of a small woman, and she don't remember very much about her, and very little about my grandfather. But in the years that passed, he eventually had to leave the farm after Grandmother Fletcher died. He left the farm and moved to Willacoochee and lived with his daughter Margaret, who was my grandmother Sarah's sister. Margaret and Sarah were their only children. And so he lived with Margaret until his death. And I can remember very little else about him. He was, to me, I was so small, I thought he was a big man. And I can remember going out to their farm and eating that wonderful food that was always prepared there. One of my mother's cousin, Edna Moore, she was one of the greatest cooks around, and she would always prepare the food when she was there, and the meals, and we just had a great time visiting them. Your grandmother said, she would talk about some of the times that they lived in the log cabin when she was very small. And she would talk about how good that they were to her. They were very good to her and her Uncle Paul, and they took very good care of them. And she always loved both of them as if they were her parents. Because they were the only parents she knew, actually, and so she thought a great deal of them, and they loved her and Uncle Paul, and they were raised properly by their grandparents. Uncle Paul was, don't remember much about him. He used to come out to my Grandpa Fletcher's once in a while when we would be there visiting, and I can remember one of the early memories about him was he was somehow had acquired a Model A Ford coupe with a rumble seat, very pretty car, and I can remember him driving that car. He eventually joined the Navy during World War II, went into the Navy and served in the Navy, and he came back home and settled in Willacoochee. Prior to his joining the Navy, he had acquired a car from my grandfather Fletcher's estate, and he at first had lived in Atlanta, and but he had moved to Mobile, Alabama, and that's where he left his car in storage when he went into the Navy. He worked as a mechanic, and he was a good mechanic at service stations at 5 Points area in Atlanta, and also in Mobile, I believe, where he was when he joined the Navy. Well, after the Navy, he came back to Mobile, picked up his car, and came to Willacoochee and settled there. And he started working at a service station in Willacoochee as a mechanic, and he did very well there. He eventually married a lady from Berrien County named Nellie Brogdon, and Uncle Paul and Aunt Nellie. Aunt Nellie's family had farmlands in Berrien County, and so they spent a lot of time out there. And in fact, I believe that after they first married, they lived in a little house just outside of Willacoochee. But eventually, after Nellie's father died, I believe she inherited some of his estate, which was a farm out there in Berrien County, on the road between Willacoochee and Lakeland, off to the, I guess it'd be to the east of the highway. There was their farm, and that's where they lived when Uncle Paul passed away. He passed away while he and Aunt Nellie were in a car driving around the fields. He just died at the wheel of the car. It wasn't going very fast because they were in the field. So after that, Nellie, of course, started working. She worked at the Forestry Service at a fire tower, and she spent several years doing that. And she died a few years ago. But that's about the most I can remember about Uncle Paul. He had a few wild oats, and he loved to have a good time. But Nettie kind of toned him down a little bit after they were married, and so he and Nellie lived in Willacoochee until his death, until her father's death, and she got the farm and they moved out there. Senie Jones was a lady of color who lived, I can remember, my earliest memory of Senie was she lived in a little house near Grandpa and Grandmother Fletcher in Berrien County. And she helped my Grandma Fletcher, and she helped with the raising of my mother and Uncle Paul. And she was a hard-working lady, and she had at the time she had a son named Johnny. Her husband's name we just knew him as Jones. His last name was Jones. Never knew if he had a first name or not. But anyway, they had a son named Johnny. And then there was a girl named Gertrude and one named Viola. And those are their children. Later on, I think they had more. I don't know how many children they had, quite a few, I think. But anyway, Senior lived out there, and she helped on the farm. Well, after my mother married and began to have children of her own, myself and my siblings, Senie lived in Willacoochee. She moved to Willacoochee after the Fletchers moved away from the farm, and she helped my mother raise all of her children, and she helped my mother with some of her chores that my mother just couldn't do all by herself, because she was raising children and running the household and all. She was very, very busy all the time. After my mother became which we'll get into later, became the manager of the senior citizens home, she would deliver meals to Senie and to the other shut-ins. And but she was kind of devastated when Senie passed, and because it was a great loss she thought, to her and her family, and it was. Senie was part of our family, actually. Mm-hmm.
Where was Ruby born?
My mother, Ruby Rouse Giddens, was born in Alapahaw, Georgia, which is in Berrien County in South Georgia, on March the 15th, 1910. Her parents were J.J. and Sarah Rouse, Sarah Fletcher Rouse. She had a brother named James Paul, and I'm not sure who was the oldest, my mother or my Uncle Paul. And then there was a third child born, and the child's name was James Aldine. James Aldine died as an infant.
Stars